Usually when we think about a battlefield, and I mean literally any battlefield in human history, there's this expectation of just an absolute unbreakable binary.
Right, friend or foe.
Exactly. It's like a light switch. You're wearing one uniform, the enemy's wearing the other, and the directive is just survival.
Yeah.
There's no gray area when someone is, actively trying to kill you.
Yeah, it's the ultimate boundary line. You have to categorize the world into us and them just to mentally engage in warfare.
Right.
If you start seeing the enemy as like a complex individual with a family and shared interests, the whole psychological architecture of combat just falls apart.
Yeah, you're aiming at a color, at a flag, it has to be clean. But then you step into the world of the American Civil War, which is arguably the bloodiest, most deeply fractured moment in United States history.
Hmm.
And suddenly, in very specific documented instances, that binary switch just breaks.
It completely shatters.
We're looking at a historical landscape where right in the middle of the carnage, the brutal rules of war just like pause.
Yeah, it is a complete historical anomaly. I mean, it totally disrupts our modern understanding of how absolute and dehumanizing that conflict was.
Right.
When you look closely at the primary accounts from the time, you find these moments of bizarre, almost medieval chivalry, just randomly interrupting industrialized slaughter.
And that anomaly is our entry point today. So, welcome to this deep dive. If you're listening, this is part 3 of 4, the golden age of fraternalism and civic power, roughly covering 1865 to 1965.
It's a massive century to cover.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore a century of American history where voluntary associations and secret societies weren't just niche clubs for guys who like to wear funny hats on the weekends.
Right, there were way more than that.
Exactly. For a period spanning roughly the end of the Civil War to the dawn of the Internet age, these fraternities were the primary social safety net. They were the civic backbone and the absolute power networks of the United States.
We are tracing an incredible arc here, based on a massive stack of historical research we've pulled together. We're going to start in the mud of those Civil War battlefields, and then we'll move into the jaw-dropping architectural marvels of the 1920s, where these groups had, honestly, more influence than a lot of local governments.
Wild to think about.
And eventually we'll look at the pivotal and often completely overlooked role these exact same organizational structures played in the civil rights movement.
So I want you, listening right now, to try and imagine a world before modern infrastructure, before health insurance was just tied to your employer, before Social Security existed to keep the elderly out of poverty.
Which is hard for us to conceptualize today.
It is. Imagine a world before digital networking, before you could look someone up on LinkedIn or, raise money for a tragedy on GoFundMe. Imagine a time when an unspoken gesture or a very specific grip of the hand could literally save your life in a prison camp.
Or guarantee your kids wouldn't starve if you died in a factory accident.
Exactly. That is the world we are stepping into. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the Civil War because how on earth does a secret society function in the middle of a marching army?
Well, it functioned because they literally took it with them.
What do you mean?
I mean, the Civil War was an existential crisis for the Republic, obviously, but the institutional structures of Freemasonry demonstrated this wild resilience right across the combat lines. We have this phenomenon known in the research as field lodges or traveling lodges.
Wait, like a pop-up franchise? Are they building a little wooden lodge room in the middle of a war zone?
Not quite a building, no, but a fully functional, chartered entity. These were official lodges authorized by both the Union and Confederate Grand Lodges.
So they were officially sanctioned by the higher-ups.
Exactly. They operated right within the marching regiments. So a regiment would carry a specialized military chest containing all the necessary regalia, the ledgers, the working tools.
Wow.
And when they made camp, they would set up a canvas tent, post a guard outside to ensure privacy.
The guy they call a Tyler, right?
Right, the Tyler. And they would conduct their rituals and their business right there in the encampment.
That is just surreal. You have these men, exhausted, heavily armed, fighting for completely opposing visions of the country. But when the guns stopped for the night, a Union soldier in Virginia and a Confederate soldier a few miles away are holding the exact same meeting.
Yep, reading the exact same moral allegories, using the exact same passwords.
That is crazy.
And this is crucial because it introduced hundreds of thousands of young citizen soldiers to fraternal initiation while they were deployed.
Oh, I see. It's a massive networking event, basically.
Yeah, it created a massive shared lexicon. And what we see in the historical records is that this shared knowledge, recognition signs, spoken distress formulas, or even just noticing a square and compasses carved into a guy's pipe.
Or worn as a pin, maybe.
Exactly. These things repeatedly initiated cross-belligerent interventions.
Enemies helping enemies. Give me a sense of the scale here. We talking about a couple of guys turning a blind eye, or is this systemic?
It was incredibly systemic, particularly in the major prisoner of war installations. Take the Union Depot at Johnson's Island in Ohio, or the Confederacy's infamous Andersonville camp in Georgia.
Oh, man. Andersonville.
Yeah, conditions at Andersonville were beyond horrific. We are talking about deliberate starvation, rampant disease, total exposure to the elements. Men were literally living in holes in the mud.
A literal living nightmare. So how does a secret handshake fix starvation?
Well, it doesn't fix the macro problem, obviously, but it created these micro networks of survival. Within those camps, Masonic officers and enlisted men organized informal relief committees.
In the camp.
Yes. They would identify each other and then use those fraternal connections to coordinate with their captors.
The guards.
Yeah, the guards and camp administrators, who were also Masons, they would covertly distribute supplemental rations, winter clothing, and smuggled medicine.
Wow.
They even facilitated the exchange of uncensored letters to families back home right across the security cordons.
Let me wrap my head around this. A Confederate guard at Andersonville is risking severe disciplinary action, maybe even being charged with treason, to slip a blanket to a Union prisoner.
Yes!
Simply because they both took an oath in a room years prior.
That's exactly it. They viewed that fraternal oath as superseding the temporary political conflict of the war. They established a baseline of humanity in an environment that was designed to be entirely inhumane.
That is wild.
And it wasn't just hidden away in the prison camps. There are specific battlefield moments that look like something out of a historical fiction novel. Like, let's look at the Battle of Galveston.
Okay, down in Texas.
Right. New Year's Day, 1863. Confederate forces under Major General John B. Magruder launch an assault to recapture the port from the Union.
Okay.
During the fighting, they managed to disable a Union gunboat, the USS Harriet Lane, and the executive officer of that Union ship, Lieutenant Commander Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright II, is killed in the brutal close-quarters combat.
Okay, so a high-ranking Union officer is dead on a captured ship. I mean, standard military protocol would be a mass grave, or at best, a quick, unceremonious burial by the victors so they can get back to fortifying the port.
Exactly. But fraternal protocol overrides the military one here. The Confederate officers discover Wainwright's Masonic affiliation. And instead of dumping him in a trench, Major General Magruder actually coordinates with the local Galveston Masonic Lodge, which was Harmony Lodge number 6.
Wait, he stops the war effort.
They literally suspend tactical operations in that sector.
You're kidding.
No. Magruder and the local Texas Masons organize a joint military fraternal funeral procession right through the occupied city.
Wow.
You had Confederate troops escorting the body of the Union officer they just killed, burying their adversary with full formal Masonic honors side by side with local civilians.
That is just, it is almost impossible to imagine today the level of respect required to pause a war for an enemy.
It really is.
But, okay, I have to bring up the elephant in the room regarding Civil War Masonry. We have to talk about Gettysburg, July 3, 1863, Pickett's Charge. Because this is where the historical reality and the Hollywood mythos seem to really blur together.
Right, the high watermark of the Confederacy. It is the absolute climax of the battle.
So the setup is insanely dramatic. Confederate Brigadier General Lewis Addison Armistead breaches the Union line at the stone wall at the angle on Cemetery Ridge.
Yep.
He gets shot down, mortally wounded right inside the defensive perimeter. And the commander of that specific Union perimeter happens to be his close pre-war friend, Union Major General Winfield Scott Hancock.
It is quite literally a tragedy of Shakespearean proportion.
Right, but maybe a little too Shakespearean, because the lore that always gets passed down is that as Armistead fell, he threw his hands up in the air and yelled out the traditional Masonic distress cry. Something like, is there no help for the widow's son?
Right, that's the story.
and that a Union captain named Henry Harrison Bingham, who was an aide to Hancock and a fellow Mason, supposedly heard this magical password over the deafening roar of tens of thousands of artillery shells, recognized it, and rushed through a hail of bullets to cradle his dying brother.
Yeah.
So let me play the skeptic here. That sounds like a script written 50 years later to sell books. People don't hear spoken passwords over cannon fire.
Your skepticism is entirely justified. That highly romanticized version is a historical embellishment.
I figured.
Historian Michael A. Halloran did a massive archival reassessment of this exact event in his work on Civil War Masonry.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he went back to the primary source documents, the letters, the diary entries, to basically separate the campfire lore from the documented reality. And the reality is far more grounded, but I would actually argue it's much more meaningful because it's real.
Okay, so bust the myth for me. What actually happened in the dirt at the angle?
First, Halloran confirms that both Armistead and Bingham were indeed active Master Masons. Armistead was from a lodge in Virginia, Bingham from Pennsylvania.
Okay, so they were brothers.
Yes. But their encounter was not triggered by some mystical distress cry echoing over the battlefield. Armistead was shot, he fell, and he was captured. It was purely a battlefield coincidence that Bingham was the officer who happened to come across him during the chaos of the immediate aftermath.
So Bingham didn't charge through active gunfire because of a secret password.
No, he did not.
So the Hollywood cinematic rushes out. But once they're face to face, does the fraternity actually matter?
It completely dictates what happens next. The initial meeting was chance, but the interaction was entirely defined by authentic fraternal obligation.
How so?
Bingham recognized a fallen brother. Maybe it was through conversation as Armistead lay dying or noticing a piece of jewelry. Once that connection was made, Bingham didn't just leave him to the overworked field surgeons.
Right, they had a lot of guys to treat.
Exactly. But Bingham personally oversaw the medical triage for him. He stayed by his side, and he secured Armistead's personal effects. His spurs, his watch, his pocketbook. Bingham made an absolute vow to ensure those items were safely returned to General Hancock so they could eventually be sent to Armistead's family in the South.
So it's the administrative care after the extreme violence. He is treating him with dignity rather than as a piece of captured meat. And that encounter is still viewed as a massive deal, right? I mean, there is literally a bronze statue dedicated to it.
Yes, the Friend to Friend Masonic Memorial. It was dedicated in 1993 by the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania and the National Park Service right there at the Gettysburg National Cemetery Annex. It depicts Bingham aiding the fallen Armistead.
So why do we care so much about this? I mean, it's a touching story, but why did these specific battlefield moments become legendary? Why did they build a statue for a guy handing over a pocket watch?
Because of what happened after the surrender at Appomattox, the United States was a shattered, traumatized nation. Think about the institutions of the time. Major Protestant denominations, like the Baptists, the Methodists, they had split over the issue of slavery before the war. And they remained fractured along northern and southern regional lines for decades after.
That makes sense. The anger was still there.
And the political parties were viciously divided. But the Grand Lodges across the North and South reestablished formal fraternal correspondence almost instantly.
Wait, really? So while the churches are still refusing to talk to each other, the Masons are shaking hands again?
Yes, they needed a mechanism to heal, to stitch the white male population back together. The shared memory of this battlefield mercy.
Like the stories of Magruder and Wainwright.
Exactly. And of Armistead and Bingham. Those stories became a primary cultural engine for sectional reconciliation.
Let me guess how this played out culturally. If you focus on the chivalry, you don't have to focus on the cause of the war.
You hit the nail on the head. It provided a massive psychological out. By framing the Civil War not as a catastrophic, bloody struggle over the brutal evils of human chattel slavery, but instead reframing it as this honorable tragedy fought between chivalrous, well-meaning brothers who simply disagreed on constitutional principles.
Right, it perfectly aligned with the emergent lost cause mythology in the South and the desire to just move on in the North.
Exactly. It allowed white Northern and Southern men to reunite around a shared, elevated civic identity. They could look at each other and say, look, we fought hard, we were brave, but beneath it all, we maintained our brotherhood. We are the same.
It was a rapid, highly effective cultural rapprochement. But, and this is a fundamental flaw that we are going to explore deeply in a little bit, This rapid national reunion was grounded in a strictly segregated fraternal sphere.
Yes, absolutely.
The entire narrative of reconciliation depended upon the continued systemic exclusion of African American soldiers and Prince Hall Freemasons. They knit the nation back together by drawing a very firm line around who was allowed to be considered a brother.
It is the ultimate paradox.
The very mechanism of empathy that healed the country was built out of exclusionary bricks. But that knitted together, rapidly industrializing nation is what rockets us into the Gilded Age. And this brings us to the absolute explosion of these societies.
The golden age of fraternalism.
Yes, roughly 1870 to 1920. If the Civil War planted the seed of shared identity, the late 19th century is the harvest.
I want to throw some numbers at you because when I saw the data on this in the sources, I had to read it twice.
The demographic statistics from the Gilded Age and Progressive Era are genuinely staggering. It is unlike anything we have seen before or since in American history.
We are talking about a society that goes absolutely feral for voluntary associations. There was a social commentator in 1897 named W.S. Harwood.
Right.
He wrote an analysis for the North American Review, and he calculated that out of an adult male population of roughly 19 million in the United States, more than 5.5 million men held active membership in secret societies.
That is nearly 30% of the adult male population at the time, and that is a conservative estimate, really.
Yeah. A few years later, in 1899, Albert C. Stevens compiled the Cyclopedia of Fraternities. His research estimated that nearly 40% of all adult American males belong to at least one fraternal order.
Let's visualize that for a second. 2 out of every 5 men you pass on the street, regardless of their profession, are secretly wearing a lapel pin, paying dues to a lodge, and attending ritual meetings.
Exactly.
Think about how fragmented our society is today. If you tried to put 40% of modern American men in one room and get them to agree on anything, it would be a riot. It is almost impossible to imagine a single civic mechanism capturing that much of the population.
And it wasn't just a monopoly by one group either. It was a whole ecosystem.
Right. Historians refer to the big 5 dominant orders that anchored this expansion, don't they?
Yes, a massive ecosystem. You had the Freemasons, obviously, who were the oldest and most prestigious. But alongside them, you had the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, or the IOOF.
Okay.
You had the Knights of Pythias. You had the Ancient Order of United Workmen, the AOUW, and the Knights of the Maccabees.
I've actually heard of the Odd Fellows.
Yeah, and their membership growth didn't just match the population. It consistently outpaced the rate of national population growth and urbanization throughout the entire era.
Okay, so here's the million-dollar question. Why? What is driving this? Why is a guy who works a 60-hour week in a steel mill spending his precious few hours of free time learning secret handshakes and marching around a lodge room?
I mean, the aesthetic is cool, but nobody commits that much time and money just for the aesthetic.
You have to look at the brutal, practical, economic reality of the late 19th century. To really understand the fraternal boom, you have to read David T. Beto's work, specifically his book From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State.
What does he say?
He breaks down the sheer precarity of life before the 1930s.
Right, because before the New Deal, the state provides absolutely nothing.
Zero. There is no state safety net. There is no workers' compensation. If you lose your arm in a textile loom, the factory owner fires you and hires someone else.
Just like that. Just like that. There is no universal health care, no old age pensions, no unemployment insurance. A single industrial accident or a severe bout of tuberculosis could render a completely stable middle-class family completely destitute overnight. They would literally end up in the county poorhouse.
So the lodge steps in to fill that void. I was trying to come up with an analogy for this, and the best I can do is that joining a lodge in 1890 was like a blend of a modern GoFundMe campaign, a medieval trade guild, and your employer's health insurance, all rolled into a single secret society.
That's a really good way to put it.
How did the economics of it actually work?
It was a highly structured system of mutual aid. You pay your initiation fee and you pay your monthly dues. That money goes into a collective treasury.
Makes sense.
In return, you enter a contractual yet brotherly agreement. If you get sick or injured and cannot work, you are legally entitled by the lodge bylaws to fixed weekly sickness benefits. The records show this was typically $3 to $6 a week.
Which, back then, is the difference between surviving and starving. It keeps the rent paid and the coal in the stove.
Exactly.
But it wasn't just them mailing you a check, was it? There was physical labor involved.
Yes. And this is perhaps the most intense and forgotten aspect of the era. Mandatory bedside nursing rotations.
Wait, mandatory?
Yes. If a brother fell ill, the lodge didn't just send money. The master of the lodge would consult the roster, and he would assign healthy members to sit night watches with the afflicted brother.
But what if I'm tired and I just don't want to go wipe the brow of my neighbor who has cholera?
If you refused your assigned rotation without a valid medical or work excuse, you would be heavily fined by the lodge
Oh, wow.
and potentially face social ostracization or even expulsion. You were contractually bound to care for them. You would literally sit by their bed, administer medicine, and comfort them through the night so their exhausted wife could actually sleep.
That is profound. It's forcing empathy through institutional rules.
It was an intense, binding community commitment that we just do not have an equivalent for today.
And what if the worst happens?
Yeah.
What if the sickness benefit isn't enough and the guy dies?
That is where the mortuary funds came in. This was a massive innovation at the time. John Jordan Upchurch, who founded the Ancient Order of United Workmen in 1868, actually pioneered the concept of assessment-based fraternal life insurance.
Assessment-based. So how did that work?
If a brother died, every member of the lodge was assessed a specific fee, say $1. That pooled money provided a standard lump sum survivor benefit to the widow.
Okay.
The AOUW provided up to $2,000.
$2,000 in the late 1800s is a staggering amount of wealth for a working-class family. That
Yeah.
pays off a mortgage. It keeps the kids in school instead of sending them to work in a coal mine.
Exactly. It protected the family from complete ruin. And at the macro level, the statewide Grand Lodges were aggregating this capital to build massive physical infrastructure.
Like hospitals.
Yes, they constructed extensive networks of residential orphanages, hospitals, and homes for the aging. If you visited a Masonic or Oddfellows retirement home in 1910, you would find elderly members and fatherless dependents being supported with dignity, surrounded by manicured lawns and good food, entirely funded by fraternal dues.
Okay, so the economic incentive is brilliantly clear. It is literal survival in a hyper-capitalist, unregulated world.
Absolutely.
But man does not live on bread alone. There has to be a psychological component to this boom, right? Because they could have just formed insurance companies. They didn't have to wear aprons and swear oaths on altars to pool their money.
No, you're right. The psychological aspect is just as important as the financial one. Historians like Mark C. Carnes, who wrote Secret Ritual and Manhood in Victorian America, and Lynn Dumenil, author of Freemasonry and American Culture, have heavily analyzed this.
What's their take?
You have to picture the massive disruptions of the era. Rapid industrialization, the explosion of loud, dirty urban centers, the sudden rise of impersonal, bureaucratic corporate structures.
The world is changing faster than human psychology can adapt to it. You go from living on a quiet farm where you know everyone, to living in a cramped tenement working in a factory where you are just a number on a payroll sheet.
It was profoundly alienating. And simultaneously, the domestic sphere was changing.
How so?
Victorian culture placed the burden of moral instruction, religious piety, and spiritual refinement entirely on the feminine domestic sphere. The home was supposed to be the wife's domain of moral purity, deeply tied to the Protestant churches. Men felt increasingly alienated not just at work, but they felt like rough, unwelcome guests in the moral center of their own homes.
So where do they go? I mean, the saloon is too disreputable for a middle-class manager, and the church feels too feminized by Victorian standards.
Exactly. So the Fraternal Lodge provided an exclusively masculine sanctuary. It was a closed ritual space where men could participate in intense moral allegories, communal feasts, and intimate fellowship, completely shielded from the demands of both the factory floor and the Victorian parlor.
I love the analogy of the lodge as an antidote to modern workplace alienation. Think about it. You are a guy in 1895. You work in a massive textile mill. You are just a cog in a machine, an interchangeable wage laborer. Your boss doesn't know your name, and you have zero control over your destiny. You are at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy.
Right.
But on Thursday night,
You wash the grease off your hands, you put on your best suit, and you walk into the local lodge room. And in that room, the outside world ceases to exist.
yeah,
There is a completely alternative status structure. That same factory clerk could have spent years memorizing the complex ritual work. He could assume an exalted title. He wears elaborate jewel-encrusted regalia. He might even be elected the worshipful master of the lodge.
which means he is the undisputed dictator of that room for the year.
Precisely. And sitting on the sidelines, legally bound to obey his gavel strikes, might be the local bank president or the mayor or the factory owner who ignores him during the day.
It flips the script on the power dynamics of the real world. It gives him dignity. And these initiations weren't just hazing, right? They were highly structured moral transitions.
Very structured. They went through allegories about mortality, the importance of virtue, philosophical enlightenment, usually based around the metaphor of stonemasons building King Solomon's temple.
And crucially, because they strictly prohibited any discussions of sectarian theology or partisan politics within the lodge room, it became this incredibly vital venue for cross-class harmony.
Yes.
It was an engine for building a unified middle-class identity.
Yeah.
The banker and the blacksmith had to figure out how to get along and run an organization together.
It was a very pragmatic system.
It's a brilliant stabilizing system for social cohesion. You pool your money, you get some dignity, you help your neighbor.
Yeah.
But human nature is complex and, frankly, a bit greedy. Once the basic needs of survival, status, and community were met within the foundational structure, what is called the Blue Lodge.
Those are the first 3 degrees of masonry.
Once those needs are met, men naturally wanted more.
They did. The Blue Lodge was the foundation, but it wasn't the ceiling.
And that desire paves the way for our next major shift. You join the Blue Lodge, you become a Master Mason, you've got the baseline mutual aid. But then there is a whole universe of branching paths you can take.
The appendant systems.
Exactly. If the Blue Lodge is getting your bachelor's degree, we need to talk about the grad school of this world, the architecture and philosophy of the appendant systems.
The post-Civil War era saw a massive expansion of these concordant bodies. These were organizations that required you to be a Master Mason first, but then offered further degrees, deeper philosophies, and eventually directed massive amounts of fraternal capital toward enormous philanthropic enterprises.
And the two main branches are the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite and the York Rite, right?
Yes, those are the main ones.
Let's start with the Scottish Rite. Break this down for me, because from what I've read, this gets incredibly dense, incredibly fast. It's divided into 2 territories in the U.S.
Yes, the Northern Masonic jurisdiction, which covers the Northeast and Midwest, and the Southern jurisdiction, which covers the rest of the country.
Okay.
And the Southern jurisdiction is actually the Mother Supreme Council of the World, founded in Charleston back in 1801. But it's in the Southern jurisdiction where we see a profound, almost overwhelming intellectual renaissance in the late 19th century, and it was almost entirely driven by one man.
Albert Pike.
Yes.
This guy is a fascinating, polarizing titan of the era. He served as the Sovereign Grand Commander of the Southern Jurisdiction for over 30 years, from 1859 to 1891. And in 1871, he publishes a book that basically rewires the entire operating system of the Scottish Rite.
Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry.
That's a mouthful.
It is, and it's a massive, incredibly dense philosophical tome. Pike was a polymath, a linguist, and a deeply esoteric thinker. He rewrote the rituals for the 4th through the 32nd degrees.
And what exactly is he teaching in those 29 extra degrees? Because I looked at some excerpts of Morals and Dogma, and it is heavy. He is pulling from Kabbalistic mysticism, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, ancient Zoroastrian texts, the Hindu Rig Veda.
He was definitely thorough.
He was trying to present Freemasonry as the ultimate universal synthesis of all ancient human philosophy.
He was attempting to trace a singular thread of divine truth through all the world's ancient religions. But at the core of his philosophy, beneath all the mysticism, was a very practical political equation regarding human progress and stability.
How so?
Remember, Pike lived through the total collapse of the Republic during the Civil War. He had a profound fear of societal chaos. He conceptualized society as a delicate balance. His primary equation is that harmony equals force balanced against wisdom.
Let's translate that. When he says force, what does he mean?
He defines force as the people, the raw populist will of the masses. And wisdom is defined as intellect, philosophical elite leadership, and moral law.
I found his analogy for this, and it is so striking, especially for a guy writing in the age of steam engines and industrial warfare.
The gunpowder analogy.
Yes, Pike argued that unguided popular force inevitably produces societal ruin. He wrote that popular force without wisdom is like unconfined gunpowder, or steam without scientific regulation.
Exactly.
If you just light a pile of gunpowder, it just explodes and destroys everything around it. It is useless violence. But if you confine that gunpowder inside the iron barrel of a cannon, the cannon being intellect and law, suddenly that raw force becomes directed, useful power.
It is a profoundly cautious, almost anti-democratic view of society. He believed that the raw energy of the masses required strict paternalistic direction from a philosophical intellect to achieve genuine progress. Otherwise, you just get the reign of terror or violent labor riots.
And you can see exactly how that philosophy appealed to the middle and upper class men of the Gilded Age. You have these factory owners, bankers, and judges who are terrified of anarchist bombings, union strikes, and socialist uprisings.
They absolutely were.
They read Albert Pike, and they see themselves as the wisdom regulating the blind force of the masses. They view themselves as the guardians of civilization.
And they built a literal monument to that exact idea. The Supreme Council's headquarters in Washington, D.C., the House of the Temple.
I've seen pictures of it. It's huge.
It was designed by the famous architect John Russell Pope and completed in 1915. It is a massive, looming neoclassical masterpiece modeled on the ancient mausoleum at Halicarnassus. It radiates authority and ancient wisdom. Albert Pike is actually entombed within its walls. It is literally a temple to order.
Okay, so that is the Scottish Rite. Heavy, esoteric, philosophical, deeply concerned with universal order. Contrast that with the other major branch, the York Rite, because the vibe here is completely different.
The York Rite is almost the exact opposite in its aesthetic and its exclusivity. It comprises 3 sequential bodies: the Royal Arch Chapter, the Cryptic Council, and the Knights Templar Commandery.
And the major difference is religious, right? Because the foundational Blue Lodge is strictly universalist, meaning men of any faith, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, can join as long as they believe in a supreme being.
Correct. But the apex of the York Rite, the Knights Templar, breaks that universalist rule. To become a Knight Templar, a candidate is required to explicitly defend and profess a belief in the Christian faith. It integrated craft masonry with medieval Christian chivalric traditions.
And they weren't sitting around reading Kabbalistic philosophy in quiet rooms.
Not at all. They adopted highly visible, military-style uniforms, chapeaus with ostrich feathers, ceremonial swords, silver belts.
Wow, going all out.
They conducted highly competitive precision drill competitions. They staged massive public parades down main streets across America, marching in the shape of crosses. It was highly visible, very militant in its aesthetic, and deeply sectarian.
So we have the deep, exhausting intellectualism of the Scottish Rite, and we have the rigid, military-style Christian chivalry of the York Rite. If I'm a wealthy businessman in 1880, and I've just spent my week running a railroad and my weekend memorizing ancient Zoroastrian philosophy or marching in a wool uniform, frankly, I'm exhausted.
You need a break.
Where do I go to just have a beer and be silly?
That exact exhaustion, that psychological pressure cooker of constant Victorian moralizing and heavy philosophy is exactly what birthed the Shriners.
The ancient Arabic order of the Nobles of the Mystic Shrine. Founded in New York City in 1870 by an actor named William German Florence and a physician, Dr. Walter M. Fleming. Talk about a tonal shift.
A massive, deliberate shift. To even be invited to join the shrine, you already had to be either a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason or a Knight Templar. So the baseline requirement means these are the elite of the elite, the wealthiest, most connected men in the fraternity. But Florence and Fleming basically created the shrine as an excuse to party.
It's the ultimate frat party for the gilded elite.
It was a convivial outlet. They adopted all this faux Near Eastern pageantry, the iconic red fezzes, the scimitars, the pseudo-Arabic titles. They designed satirical, highly physical initiation ceremonies designed to humble prominent men and make them laugh.
That's hilarious.
It was an exclusive social fraternity for the business and political elite to just let off steam behind closed doors, eat lavish banquets, and drink.
And for 50 years, that is exactly what it was, a high society playground. If you were a Shriner in 1890, you were rich, you were powerful, and you threw great parties. But then we hit 1920, and the organization undergoes one of the most remarkable metamorphoses in American civic history.
It happens at the 46th Imperial Session, their national convention, held in Portland, Oregon in June 1920.
Set the scene for us.
You have thousands of the wealthiest men in America gathered in Portland. The imperial potentate, the national leader, is a guy named W. Freeland Kendrick. He stands up at the podium and proposes something genuinely radical.
What does he say?
He says, we have all this wealth, we have all this power. Let's establish a hospital for children with severe orthopedic disabilities, and let's fund it by mandating a permanent $2 annual assessment from every single member in the country.
And the room hates it.
They immediately balked. You have to remember, these are conservative businessmen, bankers, and lawyers. They expressed deep, vocal reluctance to commit their fun social fraternity to a massive, ongoing, unpredictable financial liability.
Because a hospital isn't a one-time donation. It is a permanent, endless expense.
Right. They are arguing about liability, corporate structure, the endless drain on their treasury. The resolution is just dying on the floor.
The room is turning against the idea. They want to go back to the banquets. And then a noble named Forrest Adair from Yarb Temple in Atlanta stands up,
Yes.
and he delivers what is now known in their history as the bubble speech. I read this in the sources, and it is a masterclass in persuasive, guilt-inducing rhetoric. Can you break down what he says to these guys?
Adair understood exactly who he was talking to. He bypasses the financial arguments entirely and attacks their conscience. He tells the crowd, "I was lying in bed yesterday morning about 4 o'clock, and some poor fellow who had strayed from the rest of the band stood down there under the window for 25 minutes playing I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles."
Which was a massive pop hit at the time, a very light, frivolous song.
Exactly. And Adair continues, "I wondered if there were not a deep significance in the tune that he was playing for Shriners. While we have spent money for songs and spent money for bands, it's time for the Shrine to spend money for humanity. Let us lay aside the soap and water and stop blowing bubbles and get down to brass tacks. Let us get rid of all the technical objections. And if there is a Shriner in North America who objects to having paid the $2 after he has seen the first crippled child helped, I will give him a check back for it myself."
It is brilliant. He completely shamed them. He basically looked at a room full of millionaires and said, "We are wealthy, powerful men playing dress-up in funny hats and blowing bubbles. It's embarrassing. Let's do something real."
The psychological pivot was instantaneous. The resolution to build the hospital passed unanimously.
And the direct cause and effect there is astounding. The Shriners shifted almost overnight from a purely social elite club to building the largest, most effective pediatric healthcare network in the world.
They really did.
The first Shriners Hospital for Crippled Children opened in Shreveport, Louisiana in September 1922. Then they expanded to Portland, San Francisco, Minneapolis, eventually building a massive network across North America.
They provided state-of-the-art orthopedic treatment, pioneered polio therapies during the epidemics, and eventually expanded into world-class pediatric burn care. And here is the kicker. It was all provided entirely free of charge to the families, regardless of race or religion, fully funded by the Shriners Endowment and those annual dues.
That incredibly successful pivot into public philanthropy completely changed the public perception of the fraternity. They were no longer viewed suspiciously as just a secret society hoarding wealth. They were universally recognized as a vital public good.
Yeah, the PR shift was massive.
Every time you saw a guy in a red fez driving a tiny car in a parade, you knew he was funding a hospital for kids. And that absolute public goodwill sets the stage for their cultural dominance in the mid-20th century.
Which is when the institution reaches its absolute demographic and political zenith, the period from 1945 to roughly 1965.
The mid-century suburban peak, World War II, has just ended. You have millions of military veterans returning home from Europe and the Pacific. They've just spent years embedded in the ultimate collective service. They are accustomed to a deep, life-or-death male camaraderie. But now they're back in Ohio or Pennsylvania working a desk job, and they're looking for that connection in civilian life.
And they found it waiting for them in the lodges. The post-WWII boom saw membership numbers skyrocket. Between 1945 and 1960, total Master Mason membership in the United States jumped from roughly 2.8 million to over 4.1 million men.
4.1 million men. That is a staggering voting bloc, a massive consumer base. And as these veterans utilized the GI Bill and moved out of the cities into the newly established suburban subdivisions, the local lodge became the ultimate networking hub. It wasn't just a place to hang out, it was where the local economy was managed.
It was the place where corporate middle managers, independent hardware store owners, structural engineers, and municipal officials all mingled on a first-name basis. But this wasn't just happening in quiet suburban rooms. This massive influx of capital and membership manifested in monumental, permanent architecture right in the center of America's biggest cities.
Let's talk about the physical footprint of this power. Because urban temple associations were constructing massive multi-purpose facilities. They weren't just hiding a lodge room in a basement. They were building commercial empires. The prime example from the research is the Detroit Masonic Temple.
It is the largest Masonic building in the world. dedicated in 1926, designed by the brilliant architect George D. Mason. And to show you how tied into the industrial power structure this was, the ground was literally broken by Henry Ford himself, wielding a silver ceremonial trowel.
Just picture the physical scale of this building. It's 14 stories tall, over 210 feet high. It covers an entire city block. It contains over 1,037 individual rooms.
Yeah.
We aren't just talking about a couple of meeting halls.
Not at all.
It has 7 different crafts lodge rooms, an entire Scottish Rite cathedral, massive dining halls, 2 ballrooms, an indoor swimming pool, a full-size gymnasium, 16 bowling lanes, and a 4,404-seat public performance theater.
And that theater functioned as a primary civic center for the entire city of Detroit. It hosted the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, international touring, Broadway productions, massive political assemblies. The fraternity was deeply physically integrated into the cultural and economic fabric of the city.
To give you a modern analogy, think of wearing a Masonic lapel pin in 1955 as possessing the ultimate premium LinkedIn profile. Let's trace how that algorithm actually worked in real life. If I'm a young veteran and I want to start a business and I need a loan from the bank, I don't just walk in cold and hand them a resume.
No, you go to the lodge on a Tuesday night, you participate in the ritual, and the bank manager is sitting across the room. He sees you taking the same oaths he did. He knows you have memorized the same moral codes. He knows the rest of the men in the room have investigated your character and vouched for you.
So when I go to his office on Wednesday morning to ask for the loan, the networking has already been done. He trusts me implicitly because the institution has vetted me. It was practically a prerequisite for municipal and corporate leadership. If you wanted to be a judge, a sheriff, a bank manager, or a mayor, you needed that pin. It gave you instant civic credentialing.
And this dynamic reached the absolute highest levels of the federal government. The presidency itself was deeply entwined with this network. Look at Harry S. Truman. He wasn't just a casual member who paid dues for the optics. He was a highly active, dedicated leader. He was raised a Master Mason in 1909. While he was serving as a sitting U.S. Senator in 1940, he was actually elected Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Missouri. He ran the entire state's fraternity while serving in the Senate.
And it goes further. In October 1945, he's the President of the United States. He's just made the agonizing decision to end WWII by dropping the atomic bombs. The world is in chaos, and yet he takes time out of the presidency to be crowned a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason.
He famously participated in public cornerstone ceremonies for government buildings, wearing his full Masonic regalia, the apron, the jewels, while serving as president. It shows how completely mainstream, respected, and normalized this institution was. Gerald Ford was much the same. Raised in 1949, became a 33rd degree Mason in 1962. It was the common, expected civic qualification for post-war national leaders.
But this is where we have to stop and look critically at this golden age. We have just spent an hour describing this massive, seemingly universal, incredibly democratic American civic network. It looks like the ultimate middle-class meritocracy, a place where the factory worker and the president are brothers on the level.
But there's a huge catch.
Exactly. If we pull back the lens, we see that this massive, beautiful structure of mutual aid and power was built inside an incredibly rigid, unyielding fortress of exclusion.
It forces us to confront the profound contradictions of the era. Despite its stated foundational universalist principles, the explicit idea of the universal brotherhood of all mankind, mainstream white American Freemasonry strictly, systemically enforced racial segregation throughout the Jim Crow and civil rights eras.
We have to unpack this reality impartially, looking straight at the historical mechanics of how this was done, because they didn't just put up a sign that said no black men allowed. That would violate their own written philosophies. Instead, they created pseudo-legal justifications to make the exclusion sound like a procedural necessity rather than pure racial prejudice.
Yes, the white Grand Lodges utilized a highly sophisticated, albeit deeply flawed, legalistic framework to consistently deny the legitimacy of African American Masons. They labeled their lodges as clandestine or irregular. There were two primary mechanisms they used to enforce this color line. First was the weaponization of the freeborn landmark.
Explain how that worked. What does freeborn actually mean in a historical Masonic context?
Traditional Masonic law, dating back to the operative stonemasons of the Middle Ages, requires an initiate to be freeborn, meaning not born a slave or bonded serf. The logical reason was that a man had to be his own master to freely make the oaths of the fraternity. But post-Civil War, white Grand Lodges twisted this ancient tradition.
They weaponize a technicality.
Precisely. They interpreted freeborn as a permanent, generational disqualification for any African American whose ancestors had ever been enslaved. They argued that the taint of slavery permanently invalidated them from fraternal initiation.
Which is intellectually dishonest, right? Because it completely ignores the actual history of how Black Masonry started. Prince Hall, the founder of Black Freemasonry, and his 14 contemporaries were free men when they were initiated by a British military lodge in colonial Boston way back in 1775. They were freeborn.
It was an entirely retroactive shifting of the goalposts. The second mechanism was even more structurally insidious: the doctrine of exclusive territorial jurisdiction. This was essentially a rule the mainstream Grand Lodges invented to consolidate power. They asserted that only one legitimate Grand Lodge could exist within a state's geographic boundaries.
Like a mafia turf war, we claim New York, nobody else can operate here.
Exactly. And because white Grand Lodges organized first chronologically in most American states during the early 1800s, they used this newly invented doctrine to claim that all subsequent Prince Hall bodies were territorial trespassers and therefore illegal.
But again, this ignores the primary source documents. African Lodge number 459, the original Black Lodge in Boston, held an authentic original charter issued directly by the premier Grand Lodge of England in 1784. That piece of parchment was as legitimate, if not demonstrably more legitimate, than any piece of paper held by the white provincial lodges operating in North America at the time. They just chose to ignore the English charter to maintain their monopoly.
The historical evidence of Prince Hall's legitimacy was overwhelming, and that evidence eventually led to a massive structural challenge to the color line from within the white fraternity itself. We have to talk about the Upton recognition crisis of 1897 to 1899 in Washington state, because it is one of the most incredible, tragic stories in the history of American civic life.
Set the stage for us. What happens in Washington?
In 1897, two African-American Master Masons petitioned the White Grand Lodge of Washington. They aren't asking to join the White Lodges. They are simply asking for formal recognition of their fraternal status, for the right to call each other brothers. The Grand Master of Washington at the time is a man named William H. Upton. Upton is a formidable figure. He's a former Superior Court judge, a highly educated graduate of Yale and George Washington University Law School, a brilliant, meticulous legal mind.
So he treats this petition not as a nuisance, but as a serious legal inquiry.
He chairs a committee to investigate, he spends a year buried in the archives, and he ends up authoring a 137-page legal and historical treatise titled A Critical Examination of Objections to the Legitimacy of the Masonry Existing Among the Negroes of America.
I mean, he brought the receipts. He exhaustively proves, using English records, that Prince Hall Freemasonry held regular, undeniable lineage. But he goes further than just the paperwork, doesn't he?
He makes a profound moral argument. Upton argued that racial exclusion directly violated the fundamental ancient universalist tenets of the craft itself. He argued that you cannot preach the universal brotherhood of man while artificially denying a man recognition based on the color of his skin. And amazingly, his argument worked. In June 1898, the Grand Lodge of Washington listened to his presentation. They adopted his recommendations, and they actually voted to formally recognize Prince Hall legitimacy. They broke the American color line.
It should have been a turning point in history. But the backlash was instantaneous.
It was swift, and it was brutal. The response from the other white Grand Lodges nationwide was punitive. 16 state Grand Lodges, led by massive, powerful jurisdictions like Arkansas, Texas, Pennsylvania, and New York, instantly severed all fraternal relations with Washington state.
Let's translate what that means. They essentially instituted a massive nationwide boycott. They told Washington Masons, if you travel to our states, you cannot enter our lodges. We do not recognize you. You are dead to us. They threatened Washington with total institutional and economic isolation.
And under that immense, crushing interstate pressure, the rank-and-file membership of the Grand Lodge of Washington buckled. A year later, in June 1899, they rescinded Upton's resolution. They stepped back in line with the national segregationist consensus.
It is a devastating defeat for equality. But Judge Upton refused to concede his moral position. He essentially martyred his Masonic career for this cause. He published his massive findings as a book titled Negro Masonry in 1902. And when he died, he made an incredibly poignant stipulation in his will.
He demanded that no Masonic monument or emblem be placed over his grave until the day that white and black Masons could stand together in mutual recognition in his state.
That detail hits so hard. He goes to his grave knowing he was legally and morally right, but having lost the political war, and his grave in Walla Walla, Washington, remained totally unmarked by any Masonic insignia for nearly a century. It wasn't until June 8, 1991, following formal mutual recognition the year prior, that the White Grand Lodge and the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Washington finally came together to hold a joint ceremony and dedicate his memorial stone.
Almost 100 years later. It shows the deep entrenchment of those boundaries. Now, because of this intense structural exclusion from the white fraternal bodies, African Americans couldn't wait around for recognition. They were forced to build their own parallel power structures. And Prince Hall Freemasonry became an absolute impenetrable pillar of black civic life.
During the deepest, darkest days of the Jim Crow era, these Prince Hall lodges were literal sanctuaries. They provided a safe space for leadership development, for pooling financial capital, and crucially, for political mobilization, completely free from the surveillance and terrorism of white supremacy. You look at the rosters of black history: W.B.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, John Lewis, Medgar Evers, A. Philip Randolph. They were all active Prince Hall Masons.
This brings us to the physical manifestation of that black institutional power. The Prince Hall Masonic Temple on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia, the heart of the Sweet Auburn District. It was constructed in 1937 under the visionary leadership of Grand Master John Wesley Dobbs.
This building is a towering monument to black excellence and resilience. It wasn't just a quiet lodge room. It was the epicenter of the local black economy. It housed professional offices for black doctors and lawyers who couldn't rent space downtown. Madam C.J. Walker's beauty enterprise operated out of there. It housed Weird, which was the very first black-owned and operated radio station in the nation, broadcasting right out of the temple.
And its historical weight during the civil rights movement cannot be overstated. In 1957, right after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his allied organizers needed a secure, independent base of operations to launch their national campaign.
They can't just rent an office building. The white landlords would evict them, or worse, tell the police everything they were planning. They needed an impenetrable fortress.
Exactly. So they established the national headquarters of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, right on the top floor of that Prince Hall Temple. Dr. King directed regional desegregation campaigns, planned marches, and organized boycotts from within the safety of a Masonic facility protected by the fraternal network.
The mechanism of a safe space literally changing the course of American history. Now, we've talked extensively about men in this deep dive, white men, black men, the shifting dynamics of masculinity. But I have to ask, did women have any agency in this massive fraternal explosion? You mentioned earlier that Victorian culture pushed women entirely into the domestic sphere. Were they just sitting at home while their husbands ran the world from the lodge room?
Absolutely not. While craft Freemasonry itself remained strictly male, women established their own highly organized, parallel spheres of leadership, primarily through auxiliary bodies. The most significant and powerful of these was the Order of the Eastern Star, or OES.
Tell me about OES. How did it start?
It was formalized in 1866 by a ritual publisher named Robert McCoy, based on an earlier framework developed by a prominent Masonic educator named Rob Morris. It was open to Master Masons and their female relatives, wives, daughters, mothers, widows, and instead of the male allegory of building Solomon's temple, the OES degrees were centered on 5 biblical heroines.
Who were they?
Ada, Ruth, Esther, Martha, and Electa, and each represented a specific moral archetype. Ada represented fidelity to personal vows. Ruth was devotion to family under extreme adversity. Esther embodied courage and self-sacrifice for the protection of her people. Martha reflected deep faith and divine redemption, and Electa demonstrated patience and charity under violent persecution.
Let me challenge this for a second. On the surface, if I'm a modern listener, that sounds like standard, patronizing, Victorian moralizing.
Yeah.
Here are some nice biblical stories for the ladies while the men run the economy. Practically, what did joining OEF actually mean for the women involved? Because if it was just Bible study, it wouldn't have grown so massive.
You have to look under the hood of the organization. The ritual was the aesthetic, but the function of the organization provided a vital, highly structured training ground for female civic leadership. Remember the context. During this era, women's participation in formal political structures was either heavily restricted or outright banned. They couldn't vote, they couldn't hold public office, they often couldn't own property independently.
Right. So where do they go to exercise their intellect and organizational skills?
The Order of the Eastern Star gave women a massive, fully funded platform. By running these local chapters and statewide grand chapters, women learned intricate parliamentary administration. They mastered Robert's Rules of Order, they practiced public speaking in front of hundreds of people, and they managed substantial, multi-million-dollar financial endowments.
So they are learning the exact mechanical skills required for political action under the guise of a social club.
Exactly. They were funding and managing large hospitals, running fraternal orphanages, and overseeing complex local relief systems. They were successfully running massive civic operations and managing massive budgets long before the American political system allowed them a formal voice at the ballot box. Many of the organizational strategies used in the women's suffrage movement were honed inside these auxiliary lodge rooms.
It was a training ground for public life, a way to bypass the patriarchal restrictions of the era by using the patriarchal structure of the fraternity itself.
Brilliant. Okay, as we head toward our outro, let's take a breath and synthesize this incredible century we have just traveled through.
It is a massive, sweeping arc of American history that touches almost every aspect of civic development. We started with sworn enemies brokering informal truces in the bloody mud of Gettysburg, recognizing a shared humanity through a secret handshake. We watched that shared memory, weaponized by the lost cause, fuel a Gilded Age explosion where secret societies essentially functioned as a massive private welfare state. They literally kept millions of families afloat with sickness funds and orphanages before the government ever stepped in to do the job.
We saw the rise of the appendant bodies, balancing Albert Pike's intense fears of democratic chaos with the Shriners' brilliant pivot into pediatric healthcare.
And we saw the construction of those monumental downtown civic temples in the 1950s, creating this massive middle-class hegemony where presidents and factory workers mingled, all while wrestling with profound, deeply entrenched pseudo-legal racial exclusions that ultimately forced Black Americans to build their own parallel fortresses of power, shaping the civil rights movement.
It is an incredible legacy. But as the historical sources note, by the late 1960s, the underlying structural conditions that had sustained the century-long golden age began to permanently, irreversibly shift.
Right, because the very needs these lodges used to fill were replaced by new, massive systems. The expansion of government social programs, the introduction of Medicare, Social Security, statutory disability, it replaced the fraternal safety net. You didn't need the lodge to save you from the poorhouse anymore. The state took over that role.
The post-war growth of employer-sponsored group health insurance made the lodge sickness funds obsolete. And culturally, the privatization of leisure played a massive role. The rise of suburban television culture, air conditioning, and eventually the internet meant men didn't need to leave their houses and go to the lodge on a Thursday night to be entertained or to find community. They could sit in their living rooms.
The generational priorities shifted. Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We look at our highly fragmented world today. We replace the financial safety net of these fraternities with vast government programs and massive insurance bureaucracies. And we replace the social networking, the community gathering, with digital algorithms, social media platforms, and LinkedIn. But in the process of gaining efficiency, in the process of losing the physical in-person architecture of the local lodge room, that room where the wealthy bank manager actually had to sit face-to-face next to the exhausted factory worker, wipe his brow when he was sick, and call him brother, did we lose a kind of fundamental cross-class empathy that a digital algorithm or a government check can simply never replicate? Something to think about. Until next time.